Greetings and welcome to this roundtable organized by the International Community of Iranian Academics, ICOIA, on the implications of the attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities. So ICOIA is an independent academic network and is committed to advancing scholarship transparency and the protection of civic and scientific life in Iran. As scholars, we recognize that Iran's nuclear program, which was funded through public resources and developed by generations of scientists, has been systematically misused by the Islamic Republic to serve opaque, ideologically driven, and often confrontation strategic goals, including weaponization of the research facilities. This event is convened in the aftermath of a historically significant development. In June 2025, a coordinated military operation by the United States and Israel targeted three of Iran's key nuclear sites of Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. These strikes were conducted in response to growing concerns over the Islamic Republic's persistent violation of misusing of these facilities and the pursuit of weaponization of these facilities, despite formal commitment under the Non-Proliferation Treaty or NPT. These attacks, however, marked the first time that nuclear research facilities, particularly those involved in uranium enrichment, have been subjected to conventional military force during a state-to-state conflict. This moment raises complex and urgent questions for the international academic and policy community. The destruction of nuclear research sites by military means introduces new legal and normative challenges for the global non-proliferation regime. It compels us to consider the status of scientific infrastructure under conditions of non-compliant authoritarian states and military conflict. Most importantly, it prompts academic questions which form the foundations of today's inquiry. Today's roundtable brings together two prominent international experts whose work spans diplomacy, disarmament, and the socio-political dimensions of nuclear governance. Their insights will help us understand what is at stake, not only for Iran, but for the global future of non-proliferation, scientific integrity, and international law. Our first guest, Dr. Tarja Kronberg, is a leading expert in nuclear disarmament, international security, and the politics of non-proliferation. She currently serves as a distinguished associate fellow at the Stockholm's International Peace Research Institute and sits on the executive board of the European Leadership Network. As a member of the European Parliament from 2011 to 2014, Dr. Kronberg chaired the Parliament's delegation for relations with Iran, and which places her at the heart of the diplomatic engagement during the lead up to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Dr. Kronberg holds doctorates in both sociology and technology. Her academic work has focused on socio-political dimensions of arms control, civil-military transition, and the dual-use nature of nuclear technologies. She has previously served as Finland's Minister of Labor, as director of Copenhagen Peace Research Institute, and as a special advisor on nuclear disarmament at the Finnish Institute for International Affairs. Her most recent book, Renegotiating the Nuclear Order, a Sociological Approach, was published by Routledge in 2021 and offers a critical analysis of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the distribution of rights and responsibilities between nuclear and non-nuclear states. Messer Alamware, our other guest, is internationally recognized as one of the most effective peace educators and advocates for nuclear disarmament, international law, and nonviolence. He currently serves as the global coordinator for parliamentarians for nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament, PNNDs, and transnational network engaging legislators in advancing nuclear abolition and strengthening global non-proliferation frameworks. With a background in education and law, Mr. Ware has been at the forefront of both grassroots peace building and high-level disarmament diplomacy for over 3 decades. He played a pivotal role in New Zealand's nuclear-free legislation, coordinated legal efforts at the United Nations that led to the landmark 1996 International Court of Justice advisory opinion as the illegality of nuclear weapon, and has co-drafted model nuclear weapons conventions circulated by the United Nations Secretary General. Mr. Ware has served in a range of influential positions, including Director of the Peace Foundation Wellington Office, Vice President of the International Peace Bureau, and the consultant to the international legal and humanitarian organizations. His peace education initiatives, such as the Cool Schools Peer Mediation Program and Peace Studies Curriculum Guidelines, transformed New Zealand's approach to nonviolent conflict resolution in a school. A recipient of numerous national and international awards, including the 2009 Right Livelihood Award, which is alternative to Nobel Peace Prize, Mr. Ware has contributed to disarmament policymaking at the highest level while consistently advocating for inclusive, rights-based approaches to peace and security. His presence on this panel and Dr. Tadros offer valuable insights into the legal, normative, and humanitarian implications of the recent attack. So without further ado, I would like to start with the first question. And just a very quick remark, my name is Negar Pato. I have a doctorate in political philosophy and religious studies, and I am a co-director of ICOIA and the host of this event. So thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Taja and Ali. It's always great to hear the expert and insight of international expert. Shall we start with the first question? My first question, and Taja, I would like to start, is that what are the implications of these attacks for the future of disarmament in general globally, and particularly for Iran, in the light of recent reports that Iran's parliament is preparing a bill to withdraw from the treaty, potentially becoming only the second country to do so after North Korea? Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm glad to be here. I just want to warn you that I may be in the center of the thunderstorm in a while, so I'm glad to speak first. Well, first of all, I want to look at this military act for the nuclear order, the global consequences. And I think it's an extremely exceptional situation where a country, Israel, which is outside the NPT, never signed it, and actually has an opaque policy, has never said that it has nuclear weapons, but does have a secret nuclear weapon arsenal. Bombs a country that formally is member of the NPT and is ongoing negotiations. So during negotiations, there's always this understanding that you don't bomb in any case. Well, then comes the U.S., which actually is the depository of the NPT and also bombs a country that is, together with Israel, member of the NPT. So it's a very problematic situation for the nuclear order. The attacks are illegal. There's no question about that. I think Israel has bombed earlier Syrian facility, which was under construction, and also an Iraq facility in Iraq in 1981. And after that, the UN took a stand that this was illegal and actually according to international law. So the illegally aspect is established. Now, like you were mentioning, that there's this problem of the academics and the nuclear scientists. I was a member of the Iran delegation in the European Parliament, and during my time as a leader of the parliamentary Iran delegation, there were at least 3 nuclear scientists that were killed. And now I think there were some 10 that were killed. So this is an additional aspect which is extremely problematic, and I think actually the international community should also address this question separately. But the question now is how will the NPT, there's what do you call it? Every 5 years there's a review conference for the NPT, and there's one coming now next year, 26. And the NPT is already in a crisis in a way, because there's a polarization between the fact that the NPT allows 5 countries to have nuclear weapons: China, Russia, U.S., France, and Great Britain. And then we now have a number of countries that actually have worked for a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. So this conflict is already within the NPT. There's another conflict that is related to Iran and a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East. Actually, the NPT, when it was made permanent in 1995, agreed that there should be a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East. No country in the Middle East would have nuclear or mass destruction weapons. Actually makes the NPT
we missed 1 minute of your talk. Would you go back and just repeat your last sentence? Sorry, we missed you.
Okay. In the now this militarization of non-proliferation, actually, if it is accepted as a solution to proliferation, so that when countries proliferate, it's legal or at least customary to bomb, then of course it is non-proliferation by diplomacy and negotiations is sort of out of the question or marginalized anyway. So I think for the NPT, it's also a question of what are actually the ways we can deal with non-proliferation. Now to Iran, how Iran can deal with this question now. Of course, there are three alternatives. One is to continue to negotiate. This is a diplomatic solution, and actually negotiations are ongoing. Oman is mediating negotiations with the US, and also the European countries are working for negotiations. So it's a possibility. On the other hand, there's this problem that the JCPOA, or the Iran deal, was negotiated in 2015, where Iran actually agreed to remain non-nuclear. So actually, Iran would only enrich uranium to peaceful uses, and Iran remained non-nuclear. After this, the US withdrew from the treaty in 2018, and actually the treaty, the question is the treaty still existing? There has been discussions about it should be renewed, or it should be the basis of new negotiations. Right now, it's very difficult to say because the US has changed its sort of position. Before they said, okay, they will accept some enrichment for peaceful uses, but now they are saying that all enrichment should be stopped. So under this question, the first question is, will Iran continue to negotiate? The second question is Iran could, of course, say that we will quit our nuclear program. We will not continue, we will not enrich, we will just finish our nuclear program. I think there's a risk in this case that Israel probably does not have non-proliferation view of the Iran case, but has a regime change view of the Iran case. So the question is, what will happen then? And of course, there's the third alternative, that Iran leaves the nuclear non-proliferation treaty like North Korea did, and Israel, India, and others have not signed it ever. So, and becomes a nuclear weapon state. So I think in this situation, I will leave it to the further discussion. Among these alternatives, where do you want to go?
Yes, very complicated situation. Thank you very much, Dr. Taja. Alan, would you like to comment on the question?
Yeah, thank you very much. But first, just let me say, I'm not really an expert on Iran policy in Iran. Taya's got much more expertise than on me, but I have been involved in the non-proliferation treaty process for decades. So that's where I can sort of like look at where does this fit in, what's happening within the NPT, but just as importantly, what's happening outside the NPT. So let's look at sort of like, what Iran is talking about at the moment. There's legislation, in the parliament about withdrawing from the NPT. This is not the first time that Iran leadership has indicated that they might withdraw from the NPT. We have seen it in the past, and often that's used as sort of like a political bargaining chip, to try and, get something out of negotiations. But there's a real risk that if you put that forward and you're not getting anything out of the negotiations, or they're going backwards, it might actually push the country into deciding, actually, we do want to take that option. So I think quite a lot of commentators are looking at the situation now and saying, we know that they've threatened in the past as a possibility. They haven't followed through, but this time might be different. Particularly because the dynamic has been changed with these military attacks against the nuclear facilities. And as you mentioned, these are serious attacks, not just against the facilities, but against even the research part of this. So let's have a look at, you mentioned one other country that's withdrawn from the NPT. That's North Korea. Now, when did they do that? North Korea did that after Libya had basically voluntarily given up its nuclear weapons in order to try and build its relationship with Europe. And then Libya was attacked. And George Bush put 6 countries as like he called the axis of evil. The ones where the United States was interested in regime change. And, Taya mentioned the United States is not the only one that has ambitions to change the regimes of other countries. This is where it's much more of a threat to the countries. So North Korea saw what happened with Libya giving up its nuclear weapons and then getting attacked with the idea of regime change. So North Korea goes, wow, if you don't want to be attacked, maybe you better have nuclear weapons for deterrence. So here is when you're talking about deterrence versus disarmament, that's a very real question, because this idea of developing nuclear weapons often doesn't come in a vacuum. It's got also to do with security issues faced by these countries. So here, North Korea was listed as on the axis of evil. One of the other countries on the axis of evil had been attacked, as had another one, Iraq. So they go, oh, we may be next. So that was what they announced when they made the decision to leave the NPT. We need to now, because we can't rely on the goodwill or international law, we need to rely on deterrence. So will Iran make that decision? We don't know. There are other options available. And it's, again, it's not just in a vacuum. And Taya mentioned another really important process that's happening, which is the UN conference on establishing a Middle East zone free of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. Now, I say this because this was originally a proposal of Iran. It's now sort of been taken forward more by Egypt. It was being discussed in the non-proliferation treaty regime for a long time through the review conferences of the NPT, but it wasn't getting that far because, well, Israel is not a member of the NPT, and these countries would want Israel to be part of the zone. So it was in a sense, taken out of the NPT and has been turned into a UN General Assembly process. Now, Israel is still not participating, but it's there. Every year for a week, governments, particularly from the region, but also others involved, like the stakeholders for the NPT, will turn up and are speaking about ideas of a wider regional approach. Now, if there is progress on that, then that helps, I think, to keep Iran in the NPT, because they'll then see that, oh, look, it's not so hypocritical nor discriminatory, that people are also concerned about, say, the potential weapons, or should I say the undisclosed, but we know they have them, weapons of Israel, and are taking attention on that. If there's nothing happening on this process for a Middle East zone free of nuclear weapons, Iran may sort of feel, which it does to some degree, oh, this whole thing is discriminatory. They're attacking Iran, and we don't yet have nuclear weapons, whereas another country with nuclear weapons is getting off scot-free. So that's where I think it's not just to do with the NPT, it's also to do with the broader process of a UN, a Middle East zone free of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. I think also in that is and Taya sort of mentioned that there needs to be a stronger emphasis on international law. And Taya mentioned that these attacks have been determined, such attacks against nuclear facilities have been determined as a violation of international law, and the International Atomic Energy Agency Board of Governors has determined that as well. So it's not just within the UN; it's within the monitoring body. So when there was this action, by the US and Israel, which is a violation of the law, there needed to be there was some resistance in reaction to it, but I think there needed to be an even bigger reaction. Maybe this is something which also needs a determination from the International Court of Justice. Like it could be done as an advisory opinion, which would not specify just, the Iranian situation, but the whole idea of military attacks against nuclear facilities. Is that a violation of international law? That's one possibility. There are others also, but I think re-emphasizing that the law is so important, and when you move away from the law, then actions become discriminatory. The law should be applied equally and fairly by all, and that's where legal process, I think, is very important. And legal process can support diplomatic process. So the final thing is I agree with Taya, there are still possibilities for negotiations on this and for diplomatic process. But it's much more difficult when you have powerful countries violating the law, around the same time as they're supposed to be negotiating.
Thank you very much. Your discussions actually brought me to my second questions, which is about the role of international communities. So we do have a state who lacks transparency. IAEA has issues with it. You have concerns from Israel. You have concerns from United States. U.S. withdrew from JPCOA, and then Iran, according to the last IAEA's report, Iran increased enrichment from 3.62. So these are all problems. Now, my question to both of you is that would this attack to the research facilities, and the case of Iran actually, can trigger new understanding and then new mechanisms in the international level? So you think about all these three research facilities, particularly Fordo. There is huge amount of money, investment has gone into it. And this could, of course, the state is using it with dual reasons. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the people should be trapped into the system. And it actually looks at Dr. Tyer's book about sociology of nuclear. So my understanding and my question is, would there be a possibility to develop a nuclear system at the highest level, at the United Nations, to say that during the time of conflict, or when there is a state who is non-compliant and authoritarian, there would be a blockade of the use of those research systems or those facilities by the international community, so we don't lose the possibility of having a peaceful research facilities, which is now destroyed and has to spend millions of dollars again, and we never know if it's going to happen, or whether it will be a kind of like a non-compliance zone. So what else could we, would the case of Iran start a new regime, a new systems that we gives international community more power when you have a non-compliance state in a conflict situation? So Dr. Taya, would you like to comment on that? Thank you.
Yes, I think today is the day when we have to remember Hiroshima. And it's 80 years ago. And 80 years ago, after Hiroshima, there was a discussion about how do we solve the problems that are created by these weapons. And there were three possible solutions. One was a world government. There was this feeling that countries cannot solve these problems with nuclear weapons. They have to be some kind of world community around it. The second alternative was international ownership for material, for the facilities, and so countries could sort of apply and get the use right to them. And then the third is the world we have today, the deterrence idea that nuclear weapons with states can actually actually prevent the enemies of attacking, and in this way there is this idea of peace through deterrence. After the Hiroshima, there was a lot of discussion about international ownership, and that international organizations should control the materials. They should also own the mines, and they were voting to this, but the international community did not agree to this. There was voting, and the proposals, Oppenheimer was with them, you know, the father of the nuclear weapons, and they were disregarded. So the world government was never discussed, and the international ownership was actually rejected. So what we have left is this system we now have with deterrence and disarmament, where we try to, with countries, with negotiations, try to solve the problems in a kind of anarchical system of states. So the question is that what are the means that are available for the countries? And I think the NPT is a good example. There are no punishments according to the NPT. If Israel attacks Iraq, there was actually no punishment. Individual countries, like we know from Iran, use sanctions. Economic sanctions are used to sort of pushing a country that where the international community doesn't agree with its behavior, so the sanctions can be used. We know that sanctions are not very effective, and Iran has been subject to many sanctions, and actually they are a problem, and they are a trouble for the economy, but countries get used to them. So, and there's a third effort in the Ukraine war, when Russia started to threaten with nuclear weapons, first Ukraine and then also NATO countries, and there was developed an idea that maybe the international community could talk about that nuclear weapons threatening or use of them is prohibited, not illegal. It's too strong, but it should be not admissible, not allowed to do this. And for
Stormhead. That's very good. Ellen, would you like to comment? And then we'll come back with Dr. Taya when she's back. Would you like to comment? Because particularly I know, well, you're from a country that has two examples of this. So you started, yes, so two discussions. So first of all, the education by mother tongues was actually started by a Maori community in indigenous lobbying with the United Nations, and they pushed the idea of talking with the right to mother tongues. So that was one. But you yourself were influential in developing the nuclear-free New Zealand. So there is a legal precedent that started after an event. And I was wondering if you think that this event of a strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities could actually be the beginning of a new legal system, or an attempt to give international community more power, or reduce the power of sovereignty, or negotiate sovereignty with deterrence and diplomacy. So how would you comment, envision that?
Well, firstly, I tend to agree with Taya that there isn't an appetite in the international community for like international or imposing international ownership or control over assets or territories within nation states. That when nation states came together to form the United Nations, it was as a community of nations, not as a world federation. And there were some people, and Oppenheimer was one, Albert Einstein was another, who said that's not going to work. We do need a world federation, but that hasn't been agreed by the majority. So where are we at? We are at a United Nations of nations, and so that maintains a high level of sovereignty, but it's not absolute. There's a lot of development of international law that actually puts constraints and frames state behavior, including within states. So human rights, for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is accepted now that states have responsibilities within their countries, not just, between. So it doesn't mean we have to accept authoritarianism. We do have some tools through human rights agreements, for example, the Human Rights Council, to address some of those aspects, and civil rights. That can go along with some of these other issues. So they're not totally separate. And this is the art of diplomacy, is that you try and make one not absolutely conditional on another, but you try and make them that they'll actually support each other as you're moving along. So in that sense, I don't think I would agree that I don't think you can say we can assert control over Iran or over another country's nuclear facilities in time of armed conflict from some international agency. But that doesn't mean that we can't build up application of law, and I would say also a much better usage of the tools of diplomacy, conflict resolution, which aren't used sufficiently. So if the question was put in the terms of deterrence or disarmament, but in actual fact, there's a whole third part within the middle that can come up, which is diplomacy, mediation, arbitration, adjudication, all the mechanisms for being able to resolve conflicts and to achieve security without having to rely so much on the threat or use of force. So it's laid out in the UN Charter. It's laid out in the whole section on peaceful resolution of conflicts. But we don't have enough adherence to that. And so, for example, one of the key tools, one of the key mechanisms is the International Court of Justice. And the International Court of Justice has demonstrated that it can resolve critical conflicts between countries. 195 cases, and the majority of them, the decisions have been accepted, sometimes reluctantly, by some sides, and implemented. But at the moment, only 74 countries accept the compulsory jurisdiction of the court. And even some of those, like Iran, have put qualifications on it quite a lot. So one of the things is just a bigger push, I would say, on these tools, these mechanisms to be able to resolve these conflicts and to provide security without relying on the threat or use of force, which also means without relying on nuclear deterrence. Now, we did that in my country, New Zealand. We were under a nuclear umbrella. We believed we needed nuclear deterrence back from the Second World War, when Japan was coming down, had already started invading Australia, and we were next. So we go, the nuclear weapons, good. They ended the war and they protect us. But we did a big education effort in New Zealand that there is a better way. It doesn't have to be one or the other. It doesn't have to be weakness, to the possibility of attack or relying on nuclear weapons. So when our push for making New Zealand nuclear free was to highlight the role of the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, how we can use those and how that was the better approach. Now, I think it was easy for us because New Zealand, we're a long way away. We don't have borders right next. Much more difficult for countries like Iran, but not impossible. And I think similar, we have to look at the United States. I mean, the United States was in the beginning one of the founders of the International Court of Justice and a champion of it. But then, a case of sour grapes, when they lost the case against Nicaragua, they withdrew their acceptance of the court. Now, not every country does that when they lose a case. Australia and Japan have both lost cases in the International Court of Justice, but both been really strong, saying we stick there with the court because the rule of law is so important. And people accept that within our own countries. We know that, you may go to court, you might not always win, but just because you lose doesn't mean you destroy the court, unless you're Trump, who does try to destroy the courts when he loses. But you shouldn't. The main thing is the courts and the law are an important way of managing society. We can do that more so internationally. And there's a huge appetite for that now. There's more cases being taken to the International Court of Justice now than ever before in the history of the court. The Summit of the Future last year, which was adopted without opposition, highlighted the importance of the International Court of Justice and following along that. So I actually think there's an appetite for this. I think there is more understanding that there are good tools to be able to resolve conflicts. And I just mentioned this as some of them. The mediation service of the United Nations is superb. The Swiss mediation, good offices of mediation are superb. We can use these much better to help resolve conflicts that give rise to the idea that you may need to rely on the force, including nuclear deterrence. And finally, as I mentioned, in Iran's case, but also in other cases like North Korea's case, there are regional security issues. So that's where the idea of a nuclear weapon-free zone in a region is a fantastic idea. It's worked in other regions. We had Latin America that had two countries with fledgling nuclear programs, Brazil and Argentina. Mexico led the negotiations for regional nuclear weapon-free zone. Brazil and Argentina didn't join straight away, but it provided the context for them to then come to agreement on mutual inspections and then join the zone. Each nuclear weapon-free zone has had its own complications, but they've all managed to resolve those through smart diplomacy. So that's the same, I think, with the Middle East. Yes, there are problems. It's not going to be easy, but smart diplomacy can help bring it because it's going to be of benefit to everyone's security if you have a regional nuclear weapon-free zone approach.
I truly believe that if civil society groups and people in the Middle East would have the right to vote for a nuclear weapons of mass destruction free region, the majority of them would vote yes for that. Because I think that one of the problems that has always happens is that while for states it might be the issue of power and showing the balance of power and all those narratives that they create and construct over the weaponization of nuclear. I think for people it has always been an issue. So I don't think anybody wants to live in a region that has a lot of nuclear weapons and a lot of mass destruction weapons of mass destruction. But we have a participant, Rebecca, kindly offered two comments, and I will read them. One of them was very related to. Sorry, Dr. Tyre is calling me. She couldn't connect because the storm hit the electricity. Would you mind to just comment on the first connection on the reflections about the withdrawal of the U.S. of the JCPOA? And did we hear any domestic decrying of the illegal bombing attacks on Iran? In fact, resolutions were entered in both houses of our legislature in favor of future. Please.
Thanks, Nico. I could comment on that if you wish, or alternative, could ask Rebecca to come on and speak because she's from the United States. is the co-chair of the Impact Coalition on Strengthening International Judicial Institutions, and knows very closely the Nicaragua versus United States case, which she's mentioned there, and also the JCPOA, because some of the things she mentions, she's been very close, having been in Washington and watching what was happening with the JCPOA. So maybe if it's okay, you could ask her to come.
Absolutely. Rebecca, okay, please join us.
She could come and give comments herself, which I think would be best than me doing it on her behalf.
Well, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to take the floor. I should have suspected, Alan, that you would put me on the spot, but I am coming to you from Washington, D.C. and looking at a very cloudy, somber day as we commemorate this historic milestone. Yes, just a few reflections. Of course, the JCPOA is different than the NPT and other binding treaty law because it was a non-binding agreement that was a political agreement made by the executives that was not ratified by our Senate, which one would need to do domestically to make it binding law. But I think, therefore, illustrated, even though it attempted to be fairly comprehensive in terms of carrots and sticks, just how vulnerable, how fragile those sorts of agreements are that are reliant on diplomacy and political negotiation. Of course, during the United States having backed out during the first Trump administration, and then making overtures during the Biden administration towards reentry. But with the other partners in the agreement also realizing that this is a brittle and perhaps unstable set of deals and set of compromises and set of commitments. So no formal revival occurred. And while the negotiations are still technically alive, they're functionally moribund. So that was kind of a reflection on the political and diplomatic processes and the limitations thereof, let alone, of course, the difficulty in getting a recalcitrant nation like my own, the United States, to enter into treaties. I mean, we're the only country in the world that hasn't ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Of course, we're not a member of the Rome Statute. Of course, we're not a member of other legally binding treaties. And the second reflection was also domestic political observation that far from an outcry by our minority party, even really by civil society in the United States against the illegal actions that we took against Iran, that are, to me, are manifest violations of international law. You actually had by both parties, so the Democrats as well, having resolutions lodged in also both houses bicamerally that seem to tacitly support such measures. And there is just no domestic political appetite, it seems to me, to stand for the rule of law in such regard. And obviously, we're dealing with manifest violations of the rule of law in many regards. So with all of this, recourse to the International Court of Justice and other international courts and tribunals. I could speak a little bit more about the ICC, but I won't here since neither Iran nor the United States is a state party and how it could have jurisdiction. But it is not only paramount, there is really no alternative. And when I spoke or when I put in the chat a little bit about the ripple effects of the Nicaragua v. United States case, what ultimately happened was the United States was forced to change its policy with regard to funding Contras, not only in Nicaragua, but throughout Central America. And also this contributed in great respect to peace accords in Latin America. So even when the United States said, we are fundamentally opposed to this court's decision, we deny that it has any authority over us, it resulted in change and positive change to my way of thinking. So I'm sorry I went on for a little bit, but Helen, thank you for the opportunity.
We should have invited you, Rebecca. Thank you very much for coming up and giving explanation. It's greatly helpful. We appreciate it. And we might actually bring you again to give us some comments, if that's okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's in fact what you both have discussed gave me, and Dr. Tyria is still trying to connect with us. So I'm not sure what would be the other option to connect with her. But this actually brings me into a different discussion, and that's the discussions of arms race. So in the middle of all of these problems that we have is that the competition and deterrence and these military operations, but it also there is a appetite for arms race that has been triggered by all of these problems with international law, like because nobody's committed in this scenario into international law, and that includes Iran, of course. That means that we might potentially have an arms race in the region, and that would be quite problematic. Now, my question is that how could civil societies and other groups can contribute to have a better solution when the whole international environment is very state focused and kind of doesn't resonate or doesn't include discussions from civil society, particularly if you live in an authoritarian state and you can't have a voice. This is a double problem. So I wondered, for all of you who have worked very closely with international organizations, what would be the options or the possibility for civil society groups within the Middle East to actually unite together, how they can have a voice to contribute to a better system for peace rather than result in the supremacy of deterrence. And by the default of supremacy of deterrence, you end up in a model that you have an arms race, particularly nuclear arms race in the Middle East. Ellen, would you like to comment?
Yeah, so I think, as I was mentioning, when we were working on this shift in policy in my country, New Zealand, we realized that if you just say nuclear weapons are bad, get rid of them, you're not going to succeed, because people, even though they may be horrible, in terms of their impacts and the threats, it's still like a security blanket. There's still like a feeling of security. Now, security comes in many different forms, but a lot of it is psychological. And a lot of it comes also from some real situations of threat. So there's a mix that's happening there. So the idea is that if you're trying to shift from a reliance on military security to something else, you need to offer something. You can't just say give up, give up the weapons. You've got to say, here's something that can help with security. So what are some of the frameworks that can help with security? I'd say common security and human security are two really good options to put forward. So common security is the idea that when we have conflicts with other states, rather than threatening them with weapons, we try and resolve what that conflict is. Now, that's not always possible, which is why you also need to bring in international law. So common security is a mix of conflict resolution and upholding the law. So that if you have, an aggressive state, for example, you might not be able to negotiate with them. You might try, and you should try, but you may not succeed. So you also need to, fall back on the role of law for protection. So both of those are important. But human security is another aspect to this, and this has been put forward very strongly by the United Nations with the idea of the Sustainable Development Goals. Like what should be the role of the United Nations? It's not just about ending the scourge of war, which is in the preamble, to the United Nations. It's also about building economic development. And the UN has sort of shaped that in the Sustainable Development Goals, which is like meeting our needs for education, health, welfare, employment, civil rights, those sorts of things. So common security and human security are like quite good to emphasize as being, instead of spending all these resources and all of our political capital on military security, why don't we build up common and human security? It'll be better for our society. It's much more focused on also people security, not just state security. And it's also helping to resolve the conflicts with our neighbours. So those are the frameworks that we're putting forward. As I mentioned, these are the frameworks which pretty much the UN, it's in the UN Charter. It's also very much reflected by the Summit of the Future and the Pact for the Future that was adopted. So we've got a good basis to show that this is not just wishful thinking from civil society. The governments have actually agreed to this. They've agreed to these principles. So let's push them to implement them. The problem, of course, is that with these conflicts that are going in a different direction, spending more money on weapons, but the spending on weapons hasn't come just recently with all these conflicts. There was a huge amount of money that was spending before, and a lot of that wasn't because there were these so many conflicts. It was that the weapons industry is very powerful. So we also need to address the weapons industry. They are the ones that have incredible lobbying power in various parliaments around the world. Now, not every parliament, but some of them more so than others. The US very, very strong, and Rebecca can talk about this. But I know just one example of how powerful the weapons industry has been in the United States, including the nuclear weapons industry, was when President Obama was first elected. One of the first things he did was do an agreement with Russia on nuclear weapons control to sort of limit the number of weapons. When he took that to the Congress, the entire Republican Congress said, we'll only ratify that if you spend more money on nuclear weapons. Now, sounds counter illogical. Why spend more money on nuclear weapons when you're cutting them down? This really annoyed the Russian side. The Russian parliament, therefore, then adopted a countermeasure, which is went on for pages about how Russia might respond if the United States is going to spend more money on nuclear weapons, which didn't seem to go along with the agreement that they were supposed to ratify. The reason for that was because the nuclear weapons industry was so powerful that they were lobbying, their representatives and saying, if you don't fund, the new missile system, or the new submarine system, we'll campaign for someone else in the election, and we've got lots of money. So we also have to deal with the power of the weapons industry. I've just mentioned the nuclear weapons industry. It's also conventional weapons. But on the nuclear weapons side, it's quite easy for us to do something about it, and that is to stop investing in those corporations, the ones that are making the nuclear weapons. There's about 25 of them around the world, so they're quite easy to identify, quite easy to say, I'm not going to invest, tell my bank not to invest, tell my pension fund not to invest, or my city council not to invest, or my religious community, if I'm part of a religious order, or my university endowment fund not to invest in these corporations manufacturing nuclear weapons. That will help to sort of reduce the lobbying power that these corporations have on the political process.
Thank you very much, Ellen. Rebecca, would you like to comment on this too? I can see you're commenting, so would you like to speak on the question?
Surely. So I put it in the chat, and I couldn't find a more up-to-date and still comprehensive take on joint resolutions of disapproval that have been lodged in our Congress regarding arms sales. And these are conventional arms, obviously, not nuclear arms. In light of the conflicts across the Middle East, these specifically we know are mostly focused on the situation in Gaza and arms transfers to Israel. What these resolutions highlight is the stark numbers, the billions of dollars of arms transfers and that are at stake. And unfortunately, even in the joint resolutions of disapproval that were proposed last week in the Senate, there is still bipartisan consensus that somehow this immense trade of weapons is not only viable, but in the United States policy interest. Only a scant amount of Democrats in the Senate had signed on to the joint resolution of disapproval back in March or so, and a couple more signed up last week. This illustrates, I think, really the power of the buying power of our legislature by the weapons industry that Alan pointed to. I also just wanted to come back to another point that I put in the chat earlier. Sometimes when I speak about the UN system, I liken it to a three-legged stool that has 1.5 legs. So we're often taught that there are three branches in a functioning democratic government, and those are the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. And we've spent some time talking about how we can promote the International Court of Justice and indeed the international judicial system or architecture as a whole. And we take for granted the fact that these negotiations are mostly in the realm of the executive among states. But we haven't really talked about parliament or the legislature because there is no legislature at a global level. And so actually, Nagar, when you were speaking about what can we do as citizens if we are in an authoritarian regime where we can't trust our government to represent us and our interests, that is where an idea like a UN Parliamentary Assembly that is directly elected by citizens comes in. And so that you can have opposition voices, you can have those that dissent from the official posture of who are most likely not elected officials, but representing state interests in New York or Geneva or the other capitals in which and places in which UN business gets done. And so I just wanted to highlight that campaign a little bit as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. That's fantastic. I also remember in 2015 when New Zealand became a member of the non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, and there was a discussion about Syrian conflict. New Zealand insisted to invite the Red Cross and some other civil society groups into discussion, and there was quite a lot of backlash, but they managed to actually push and invite the Red Cross to come to the meeting and give reports on that. So I think some of the states' push at the international level could help as well. But often these are smaller states and don't have that much of a power in the UN. So it would be very interesting, and I'm very grateful for that campaign. So Alan also sent another campaign for us. So we will add all of these to the recording of this talk and video, and we'll add it to our description. So thank you very much for that. Now, my last question, and this question is that, so Ellen, please.
Move on from that, and that
Yes.
it was fantastic that Rebecca indicated that at the international level, we don't have a legislative body. We have a judicial body, well, we have a couple of them actually, but the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, the executive, the Secretary General and the Secretariat of the United Nations, but that's been undermined by the governments pushing them to cut the budget by 30%, which is ridiculous. Should be increasing the budget for the UN Secretariat, but we don't have a legislative body. So there is a proposal for that, a UN Parliamentary Assembly. But in the meantime, there is a really interesting organisation of parliaments that predates the UN and even predates the League of Nations. It's the Interparliamentary Union, and it was actually established by the forward thinkers of the time, back when there was no possibility of bringing the governments together for a United Nations, but they brought the parliaments together. So it's the Interparliamentary Union. They have 181 parliaments of the members, and just last week, all the speakers of over 130 of those parliaments, met in Geneva. And I've just put in the chat a link to the speech of Michael Douglas, because he was the keynote speaker, the actor Michael Douglas, a UN peace messenger, and he gave an incredible speech about the importance of international cooperation, confident faith that we can actually work out these solutions to these problems. It's well worth looking at and seeing that we can engage with parliamentarians through some of these interparliamentary bodies, particularly the Interparliamentary Union.
That sounds fantastic. Thank you very much, Alan. I think that we can talk for a very long time about these issues, and particularly in the context of the Middle East, because you have often non-democratic states, and even if their output would be for the benefit of the people, they are often non-democratic. And because of that, you have double layers of problem, but it's also the most conflict-prone zones, and the narratives are quite strong around nationalism and the sense of that's traditional realist perspective about the correlations between power and your power of negotiating diplomacy with the amount of weapons that you have in your country. So these narratives need to be restructured in order for us to have a form of cultural change that, Alan, you were discussing about this. Now, I think I will open the floor for any particular questions. We are at the end of our discussion. I didn't even notice how this 1 hour passed, but I open the floor. If you have any questions, I'll make sure that we organize another time with Dr. Taria and speak to her about these issues, because we highly value her points. So if you have any questions of participants, the floor is yours. Okay. Alan, would you like any last points you would like to make? Any things that you think would help us to think about this problem better and find a better solution for it?
Just before that, I did put in the chat the link to the campaign for a UN Parliamentary Assembly, which Rebecca mentions. I think for me, I would just re-emphasize that we can replace deterrence, we can replace reliance on military force with common security and human security. In my mind, they go together. One is helping to resolve the conflicts between states, another is ensuring that we all have well-being within states. I think both of them together can help, address also, autocratic regimes. We are finding a way of dealing, with autocratic regimes that's, in a sense, bringing back, responsibility and accountability. It's not going to be instantaneous. It takes a while to bring back accountability and to bring these in. But we've had many success stories, and I think we can continue have more success stories in the future. And again, I will say, I think that the Summit of the Future was a wonderful demonstration that visions from the UN and civil society can have influence with the governments. Now, it wasn't perfect, it wasn't fantastic, there were some things missed out, but in these really, really difficult times, with a very strong process, we managed to get the governments to agree to international law, to multilateralism, and also to be thinking about the future and future generations. They also adopted, as well as the Pact for the Future, a declaration on future generations and a global digital compact. And these things, I think, point to that we can move forwards even in rough times. We shouldn't give up hope. And I think the last thing I say is that the speech from Michael Douglas that I put into the chat there is one about hope, and it's worth sort of like listening to it if you have a chance, watching it if you have a chance, because he gives some examples of conflicts that have been resolved, that societies have been rebuilt, and the really important role that the United Nations has played in that. So I still come forward, I guess, as an optimist. Not a naive optimist. I know there's a lot of problems out there and we need to deal with them, but I think we have intelligence, we have mechanisms available, and I think we have a general cross understanding amongst peoples around the world that we do want to live together on this planet in peace. Thank you.
Fantastic. And I completely agree with you. Rebecca, would you like to comment about your last comment? Anything that we missed? Anything you would like to emphasize?
Oh, it seems really inappropriate for me to have the last word, but I linked to the outcome documents that Alan has mentioned of the Summit for the Future, which are the Pact for the Future. And then, as he alluded to, its annexes, the Declaration for Future Generations, and the Global Digital Compact. And I will draw attention, of course, to the explicit mention in Action 25 that we will advance a world free of nuclear weapons. And as you can imagine, this language was much agitated over by states, and at different points, of course, we won't say watered down, but compromises have been made. But it's there, and that's important. And that can't be underestimated, I think. And it also serves as a jumping off point for future advocacy domestically and globally, as well as regionally, as you pointed out, Negar. This is a very useful tool. And I'll also just note that there was a companion to the Pact for the Future, and maybe Helen will get it while I draw on. That was the People's Pact for the Future, which was a civil society-led enterprise that mirrored the structure of the 5 chapters of the Pact for the Future, where Peace and Security is Chapter 2. So that is the one that we're dwelling on the most, but we recognize, of course, the intersectionality with other elements of the Pact, such as sustainability, such as climate, such as the rights of future generations. And there we, I think, have also some footholds, if you would, to take as we step on this path towards various realms of advocacy. So it's not because there isn't a template, it's not because there aren't commitments, and it's not because I think there isn't foment and will. Perhaps what's needed at this point is stitching all of this together and making sense of the component parts. So thanks again, and sorry for stealing a
Thank
little.
you very much. We were not supposed to just drag you out, but thank you very much. It has been a great pleasure listening to you, and thank you for your very insightful comments on this topic. And on that note, I'm sure that we will come back to you, Alan, and we'll come back to Rebecca, and we'll invite you again, maybe in a couple of months, to kind of revisit what we have discussed, and you can educate us about these issues. Thank you very much for the great discussion you had, for the fantastic information. We will put all the information you have given us in a package on our website and on the campaign, and as the companion of your discussions, and we'll make sure that we contact with Dr. Taria. All of you who spent time with us, on behalf of ICOIA, I am grateful for your presence and for your patience, and thank you very much for joining us in this conversation, and I hope to see you again. Thank you. Ka kite ane. Bye-bye. Have a good time.